Welcome to Talking Roadmaps, everyone, the podcast and YouTube channel where we talk about everything roadmaps, from the good, the bad, the ugly, talking to practitioners, thought leaders, and all the rest of it. Today, I'm joined by Todd Lombardo. Todd, I'm pretty sure people don't need you to be introduced, but go ahead and introduce yourself anyway.
Oh, man. Amazing. Thank you, Phil, for being here. So introducing myself, let's see. I've been in the product world for kind of a while. My first product management job, I think, was like 2003, 2004. So I'm totally dating myself. But the last decade has been spent much more on the software side. My first product management job, I had a biotech instrument, which had hardware, software, firmware, chemistry, and biology to all mix together. So if you think you're getting your front end and back end to work together is hard, try getting all those things to work together. But yeah, I'm a little bit of a pracademic. I teach at a couple of schools, a business school in Spain called IE University. And I've been sort of in a variety of products, roles, product teams, or working as a consultant for product teams over the last decade or so. Because of my pracademic nature, I like to share knowledge. So hence writing a couple of books. The Design Sprint was the first one many years ago, followed by the book with Bruce, Product Roadmaps Relaunched. And then the most recent one around product research rules. So currently I am leading the product and design teams at a company called Appcues, which is a product-led growth company that helps other companies build good app and app experiences.
Awesome. Funny enough, yeah. So, well, it wouldn't be right to be on the road mapping show and not have a copy of this in my hand. But both of those other books are also, I'm about 50% of the way through them both, because I have this habit of having 10 books on the go, dipping in, dipping out. And
I have the same problem. Here are the two on mine. And I'll give a plug to, our friend Daniel. I got his right on my desk, and I have another one called Creative Captains of Leadership around facilitative power and facilitative confidence. So I'm right there with you.
Constant growth mindset and learning, I think, is a critical part of product management.
Never stop learning.
Just for everyone out there, the mandatory, got to ask you to like, subscribe, hit that bell icon, heck, share it, or if you'd like to join us here on the channel, have a chat. You don't have to be as big a name as Todd. You can be someone who's just out there doing the job in a product organization. We'd love to talk to you. Hit us up on info@talkingroadmaps.com. We'd love to talk to you.
Smash that bell, as they say, right?
So, Todd, let's start with the fundamentals.
Yeah.
What is the purpose of a roadmap for you?
Oh, the purpose of a roadmap. Why do they exist? I think a lot of people look at a roadmap and think it's going to predict the future of my product. And in some cases, it kind of does. But it shouldn't be like, what's coming and when, like what feature am I going to get and when? And that's, I think, the misnomer about it. But a roadmap should describe that, if you think about the metaphor, right? It should describe that destination and mostly how you're going to get there. And I'll use the metaphor continually to like dig into it even further. So I'm here in the Boston area. And if I'm going from Boston to where are you, Phil, in the UK somewhere?
UK, it's near Sheffield.
Near Sheffield, right? So if I'm going from Boston to Sheffield, how would I get there? Well, I'm probably gonna have to take either a ship or an airplane. So my roadmap will have to tell me which mode of transportation I might go. And there's probably some level of turn-by-turn directions I might need now to like get myself from here to the airport. And I would say those turn-by-turn directions are very specific and what's right in front of me, because I don't need to know today, I don't need to know, like right now, I don't need to know the right and left turns I need to take to get to your place in Sheffield, but I do need to know the right and left turns to get out of the Boston area and into the airport, right? That's what I would call your release plan or a project plan, right? Shorter term, very focused, has discrete steps you're going to do. That's not your roadmap, really, quite frankly. Those are your turn-by-turn directions, right? Your roadmap says, hey, going to Sheffield, we're going to take a plane. This is the rough way we're going to go. It gives me a vision and a destination and a direction of where I'm going, right? So that's really what a roadmap does. It gives you that level of strategy and direction.
And so who's looking at that strategy and direction then?
A lot of people, especially anyone who is interested in your product. Oftentimes it's your internal stakeholders. They could vary based on the kind of organization that you're in. It could be maybe you make an internal product that never gets exposed, but could be, all those internal stakeholders. or if you do run a software or a company that has external users, it could be them, or it could be all the different executive stakeholders, like your chief of marketing, chief product officer, sales. Like oftentimes, if you're B2B enterprise sales, you've got a salesperson saying, hey, my customer wants these features. Can we build them? Are they on the roadmap? Right? That's a common thing you see happen. Depending on the size of your company, it might be your CEO. And of course, your engineering team, whether it be directors, et cetera. So a lot of people, right? I just named a ton of folks. And the point is a lot of people look at it, but classic case of it depends on who and how you tailor it for them. There are some organizations that advocate for and do share an external version. They make it public. Of course, they edit them and don't share every little last detail. But that's a common thing you'll see for some organizations that want to do that, want to engage their customer base with a publicly facing roadmap. There are challenges to that, don't get me wrong, especially if what if you put something out there that you don't end up doing? But at the same rate, like Jana Bastow is very much an advocate for this. And she's like, hey, you'll know where your customers will tell you where it's not going to add value for them. Cool, right? It's a way to get feedback on that product strategy.
Yeah, so you talked about those different audiences, and I think just to unpack it, you talked about editing for the audience. So do they see the same version? Do they see something different?
Yeah, and kind of you want it all to come from the same place, right? You don't want to have 1,000 versions. They don't actually reflect each other. So you want them to all come from the same place, but you might edit them based on who they are. If you're a large organization, you're presenting your CEO, you're probably going to get rid of all the details and give them the high level, these are the areas you want to go. This is the reason for the strategy. These are the kind of KPI and metrics we expect to move along the way. And that's that, right? But maybe if you've got I'm presenting this to my engineering team, I want to give them all the little details these are the features that we might expect to see. These are the kinds of things we want to go into. You might have a deeper level of detail depending on your audience. So again, they should all come from the same place. And some teams they use road mapping software like ProdPad, Product Board, insert app name here. There's a lot of them out there. They're all quite good. And they obviously allow you different ways to create and share those. So those are very useful for that. But at the same rate, you could also do it with Excel and PowerPoint, Google Docs and PowerPoint some way, whatever way you want to do that. So it's totally possible to do a lot of those things. But yeah, sharpen it and shape it for the audience is really important.
I think when I was interviewed myself by my collaborator, I think I said I'm on 4 or 5 different views of that one sort of truth potentially these days. It's I'm starting to get a lot, and that's when I think the tool comes in maybe and helps you a little bit.
Yes, that helps a lot when you have a lot of different types of stakeholders you need to edit or not show certain things or show other things, for sure.
I can imagine showing my engineering team that 5-year projection that I might show to my execs, and they're just going to lose their rag.
Maybe what do I build though? How do I do this? And it's okay, well, yes, we're going to get there, but they don't need to think about all 5 years in fine-grained detail as an engineer probably should. I often think about it this way, the roadmap is that plan of intent, right? It's your plan, but it's uncommitted. So it will probably change. Most roadmaps usually do. So be okay with that. Whereas your release plan is we've committed to doing this. We're going to do it. It's shorter term. And it shouldn't change as much, right? I use the 80-20 rule for either, right? Your roadmap might change up to 80%, but 20% is always going to be pretty steady and stable. Whereas the inverse of your release plan, 80% should be pretty stable because it's what you spec'd out for your engineering team. It's what they're planning to build in the next 1, 2, 3, 5 months. But beyond that, they're probably not uber detailed, depending on the kind of product you have, right? Those are the two differentiators. I think that's probably the big difference that I want to call out a lot in this is a lot of people think those two things are actually in the same document. That's probably the biggest mistake I see.
It's the jobs to be done of a roadmap. We're trying to ask it to do too many jobs. And so it ends up doing them all badly instead of a few really well.
Yes. And that's kind of where I think maybe you mentioned that, Bruce and I are going to be rewriting another version of this, a second edition of this book coming up. And part of it is the overall thesis of the book is quite sound, but how we explain it and how we sharpen some of those conversation points around like, yeah, here's really, it's the job to be done, right? It's using some of that language, which will be really useful in clarifying the concepts in the book.
That said, it's still, even in the current version, full of epiphany after epiphany, I've got to say.
What were the things that struck out to you? So, little customer discovery of mine, like what stuck out for you? What are the epiphanies that you walked away with after reading it?
Breaking the timeline, moving from timelines to time frames. I mean, I come from, you talked about that type of complex products in the biotech you did. And maybe I wasn't doing that, but I was typically doing what we call IoT type products these days. So complex connectivity, hardware, software, back end, embedded, and bringing all those things together. And I'll be honest, I still haven't found a better way than a timeline for physical products, but that kind of step away. And there was always that perspective from that as soon as I went to that, say the now, next, and later, customers wouldn't accept it or management wouldn't accept it. But in my experience, it's actually, they usually do. They just realize it's more honest.
Yeah. And it's part of it is like, I think we had a quote from the book from, I think it was Dave Cancel. It was like, I'm either going to disappoint you by telling you what I'm going to do and I'm not going to do it, or I'm going to lie to you, right? You're asking me to do one of those two things. It's a rock and a hard place. So why don't I just be honest with you and tell you these are the things that are coming up next? I can't give you just explicit timeframes. Maybe the shorter term thing, sure. And when you're thinking about hardware, software, the thing that I always try to do is like look for the connection points. Like your hardware needs to go off, and obviously you can update firmware and update software to a certain point, but figure out where those points or those sort of like connection points are. Where it's like, yeah, I can develop my hardware to a certain point or a version of this, and then I'll be able to update software to a certain point beyond that, right? And like you just think about the simple ones of our phones, and that at some point Apple's like, yeah, I can't support this hardware anymore with firmware and software updates, so you need to upgrade, or you're just going to stay in that version, right? And that's a hard truth of any hardware. So find where those points are and just kind of put them stick a pin in them and say, okay, these are the things that are like knowns that we have to design and think around and plan around, but the stuff in between leading up to and after that can obviously change.
When I think about that physical product on the portfolio level, you have that challenge. It's like Apple, it's that TikTok once a year, new iPhone coming out. Well, that's a timeline at the end of the day. I'm putting a date on it. And there's certain things like getting into catalogs and so on. But then I guess is that a release plan?
Yeah, it's a release plan. And but they don't tell you like, here's when the next iOS, like the specific iOS build is coming, right? You don't really get a specific timeline for that. They just kind of like when they're done, they ship them in your iOS updates, right? They don't necessarily publish that, but they have those very specific, like those are those points that I mentioned, like those connectivity points between the hardware and the software. Like, yep, here's this, and they've gotten to a point where they're big enough and can be predictable. Where I think that actually speaks to some of this. Like, there's an element of predictability that people want, which is why they're so attracted to seeing your roadmap. What's coming and when, right? Can you give me some predictability? And that's part of where I think some of this approach, whether it be now, next, later, or Q1, Q2, Q3, whatever, just not getting down to like month and week level, that starts to give a little bit of predictability. Like, here's what's coming. And if you also frame it with, it might change, then okay, right? You've at least set the expectation of, here's what we're planning. It might change. You want to know what the short term is? Check our release plan. And you may or may not want to publish that. It's up to you guys.
There's probably still that portfolio level, which I know is part of the plan for the next edition of the book. That is,
it is. We don't talk enough about it. That's right.
So, because I think at the individual product level, it's quite clear how you can manage that. It's that next level up that I sometimes find a little more challenging.
Yeah, and one of the other things that we're kind of want to dig into is you think about, like, we talk about like setting your vision and your goals, making sure goals and objectives are part of one of the 5 main components. But what we don't talk enough about, I think we mentioned it very lightly, is like, well, how do you structure your teams to match your goals, which matches your roadmap? Like, the Conway's law is in effect here in some way. And so making sure that we're talking about how do you set up your teams for success too? Because sometimes we'll talk to companies and they'll be like, well, I have this, but then I've got a front end team and I got a back end team, I got this other team, and everything's functionally aligned. It's like, okay, but do you deliver value just with front end only or just with back end? Like, well, no, actually, does the customer only use the front end, only use the back end? No, they use both, right? So how do you slice and dice your teams to match up your objectives, to match up to your roadmap? So they're all intertwined. One affects the other in some degree. So we don't talk enough about it. So we need to dive into that more too.
So I can anticipate we're going to be talking about platform and experience teams and this sort of thing coming forward. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, we need to add that layer in. I don't think we talk enough about it. So
funnily enough, then, who owns the roadmap? Any thoughts there?
I mean, I'm very biased, but I think the PM should own the roadmap, right? The PM should own the roadmap, and it should be driving outcomes. Engineers and engineering teams own the release plan, and that's defines the outputs. Now, granted, you get the outcomes from the outputs, so they obviously need to be very much joined at the hip. But I'm a firm believer that the PM is the one who owns the roadmap with a lot of influence from a lot of different folks. And that's what makes PM hard, right? They've got to align. Everyone wants something on the roadmap, and what they want should be at the top, right? Well, that can't happen. It's like saying everyone expects to be above average, but that's not true either, right? So you can't have 100% of people above average. Only 49%, I guess, are. So similar kind of thing. And how do you align that? And how do you make sure that everyone is okay with that and okay with those trade-offs? And that's a lot of why a PM job is so hard.
So then would I be right in assuming that the product manager also maintains that roadmap at the same time?
Of course. Mm-hmm. They own it, maintain it, they update it, they share it. Absolutely. And it should go out for, some people ask me, well, how long should it go out? Should it go out like 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? I was like, it kind of depends. There's no one right answer. Like for one team, it may be like, a roadmap that goes out 3 to 6 months is perfect. Another team might be like a super mature product. Like, look, if you don't have something going out 3 to 5 years, you're slacking, right? It really varies. And I think that's, maybe we can put a little more context around that in the next edition too, is like, hey, here are the examples where like a short-term roadmap is a really good idea. And your release plan is probably like 2 weeks. And then there's another example where like, you probably want a 3 to 5-year roadmap at a minimum, and your release plan might go out 6 months, right? Type of thing. It all depends.
I mean, I could even imagine having a release plan that goes out that 5 years with just not saying what's in it. But we're going to release certain milestones because they hit market windows or cadences in an industry.
We've got to hit this for this hardware, update or in these areas. We've got to get our hardware ready for this point in the future. So that means, what does our software cycles need to be to get there, right? Finding those points in the future, which things need to converge and align are critical. But once you've aligned those, then there'll be other points or other streams that might be able to go at different cadences and velocities.
You mentioned vision and objectives. I know they're two of the key parts of the roadmap in the book. What about strategy? What about other artifacts? What else kind of links in or relates in?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely sort of mission or vision, especially if it's a team level, right? Like depending on the size of your company, you might have a large company mission or vision that does one thing, but your product that you're managing might be one part of that. I think we give the example in the book of Google. Like if their mission and vision is to organize the world's information and make it accessible, great. But if you're a YouTube product manager, like YouTube itself is its own product. And well, that mission and vision is like, well, organize information, but in video content and make it accessible, right? So it's related to the main companies, but it's different in terms of like maybe the type of organization, the type of content, type of channel it is, right? But there's still some relationship there. And you can even think about there's sub below that, like, okay, we've got creator level products, you've got viewer level products on YouTube, and they may each have their own, like, hey, allow creators to really easily create and deploy an audience management on YouTube, and then a viewer to be like, how do I view, discover, find? There might be different kinds of mission and visions there that you could think about. And so those all can be described on a roadmap. And of course, the things you also want to make sure it's a little bit about how, right? Strategy, like how are we getting there? So if this is again, that end destination of Sheffield, UK. How am I getting there? Well, I'm going to take a plane, and this is the kind of plane I'm going to take, the kind of airline, the kind of class I'm going to go in, right? It starts to give some attributes and maybe problems to solve along the way, right? I have to get to the airport. Then once I get to the airport, I have to get from the airport into Sheffield. Then when I go from Sheffield, I got to get to Phil's house, right? All those things of like, what are the maybe a little bit layered down without getting maybe to the turn-by-turn directions, at least gives me some indication of waypoints along the way to get there.
So this is an area I've been thinking about a little bit, but then we get to the innovation end of things where actually we don't really know the end destination. Kind of, I tend to think of it, exploration. It's like if we were to draw a map for that, you've got the here be monsters part.
And that's great. And that ends up being more of probably a technology development. Like, oh, we're trying to develop a technology, but are you still solving a problem? And what's that problem you're trying to solve? Can you contextualize that a little bit? And maybe that's where a difference between a product roadmap and a technology roadmap might come into play. Is like, look, I'm looking at developing and advancing this technology. I don't necessarily have a use for it. I just want to dive in and see, is this even possible? Cool. And then you can start to think about what use cases you might have after that. So that might diverge a little bit, but I think a product roadmap is different in that it should have some kind of customer value and destination to it. If it is an innovation perspective, maybe it's just a technology development roadmap. It's less of a product roadmap, I would argue.
So, I mean, I know in the book there are 5 key elements that you talk about on the roadmap. Since you've thought about it a bit more, is there anything else you'd change, anything you'd add, what's the main content that we need to consider in there?
Yeah, I think they're mostly still pretty relevant. And the way I also frame it is we talked about having a vision being part of it. It doesn't have to once you've established it, maybe you're talking about it to your internal stakeholders and they understand, they know your vision. They're like, okay, then maybe you don't need to repeat it ad nauseum to them. It's good to make sure it's there. So, if the team is very familiar with it, do you have to have it on the roadmap you're presenting? Maybe not. Always good to tie it up hey, by the way, this is our vision, making sure that we're actually still tying things to that. It's still very useful to do. But I still think having some kind of goals, objectives, very important. Now, some people, OKRs, OGSMs, EOS, there's a lot of different goal-based frameworks, and whatever they are, some form of goals of what we want to achieve, right? And that's probably from a business perspective and even potentially a customer perspective. And that might flow out to be okay, well, we want to reduce our self-service costs, which means we want to reduce the number of support calls coming into our company. We want to add more self-service tooling to our software so that customers can figure things out for themselves much easier than having to pick up the phone or chat with us or whatever. One example. Cool. Then so under that, there may be other different thematic areas, hence the word themes. I've also heard of theinitiatives. They could even be objectives or sub-objectives themselves, ways you're going to hit those goals. So that's sort of the third bucket item is what are the initiatives or things you're going to do to reach those goals, which will help you reach those vision. Notice it kind of always cascades. And then you want to make sure you have some kind of disclaimer, oh, hey, by the way, this is a draft you have as of July 2022, so that you know that that's the timestamp and it's a draft and you're setting that expectation, right? And the last thing is on a date perspective, this is the time frames, right? We're not talking about a specific timeline. We're these are time frames. Now, next, later is a common one. That's thanks to Jenna Bastow. Q1, Q2, Q3. There's a lot of different ways, first half, second half, this year, that year, depending on the level you need to have, whatever interval you want to put there. Is it monthly? Is it quarterly? Is it semi-annually or annually, right? And think about that versus here's a set of weeks and this is when we're going to deliver these things. It's less about delivery, right? And more about strategy and where we're going versus we're going to deliver these things on this timeline. That's good for a release plan.
So, okay, we've got the key content. What about visualizing? Any strong feelings on how we visualize? Yeah, I'm a fan of visual roadmaps. Andrea, not so much. I wonder where you fall on this one.
No, I agree. I'm a visual thinker. I love to visualize things, so I think it's really important. That said, I have seen great roadmaps that are literally like an Excel spreadsheet. They literally look like they were copy and pasted from a spreadsheet. And it's wow. But when you dig into it, you're oh, this is really done well. And here's why. It has objectives, has themes, it has some status and some objective. Like it's really well done. Whereas some of them are like, if they're just like overly visual with no structure, then that's a problem too, right? I want to be mindful, like to call out, like, yeah, be careful of the Gantt chart. Be careful of the Gantt chart lure, because it is very alluring to be like, see these bars of like, this starts then, stops then, and not a bad thing. And there's a lot of, you just don't want it to have like concrete dates. It might be like, yeah, here's our bars of when we expect to roughly be tackling these particular initiatives or themes or elements. So it's certainly not a bad thing. And especially when you're thinking about portfolio, like the one I did at my last company, like we had to stack it. And we had to have like, it kind of looked like a big Gantt chart in many ways, but it wasn't like a typical Gantt chart where like everything was like, this waterfall element of things underneath. It was like, no, this is the rough time we're going to be tackling this initiative, rough time we're going to be tackling this initiative, etc. And it was useful for us to see it in this big, long document that had all of the products across all the teams available. So we could start to think about, oh, we're trying to do a lot. Do we have the resources? Are these prioritized right? Should we think about, dissolving one team and giving the other team resources, or giving one team more priority than another because of business value, right? And that's really useful to see those in that way, to say, oh, well, they're not tackling this till Q2 of next year. They're tackling this now. You can start to see those cross-team opportunities show up, and it's really, really useful. So I'm very much a fan of doing it visually. I think we used Product Board, my last company. It worked really, really well. But I know that there's plenty of others that have similar kinds of visualization.
You mentioned a few tools as we've talked there. Do you have a favorite?
I don't know if I have a favorite. I just have a lot that I like that I've used over the years. Product Board's pretty good. ProdPad's great. But I've also used like Aha and Roadbunk and a few others, and they're not bad either. Like there's a bunch of them out there, and there might even be one I'm missing. I think Airfocus I tried a little bit. They all have we use Canny at Appcues. They all have like pros and cons, and a lot of the things, I look at it as it needs to serve a couple of jobs. One, you need to pull all of your product feedback into one location, and sort of a centralized database, and you need to tag them with thematic areas. And preferably if you can get the customer's name associated, even better, right? Because it's better than having like a Slack thread with a whole bunch of stuff, or somebody putting stuff in an email, or like stuff gets put everywhere in a lot of different channels. So you need to figure out a way to centralize all of your product feedback, whether it be internally or externally, right? Got to put it in one central location. Second thing you need is a way for a team to map out what their plans are, map out what their roadmap is over the next whatever time frames are useful. Like if you expect your teams to be, crafting 1 to 2 year roadmaps, then they should be able to do that, right? If they're 6 month roadmaps, they should be able to do that, right? Whatever time horizon that is useful, they need to be able to map that. And so when you start to connect those two together, and that's where some of the tools are really useful, is like, oh, I can put the roadmap theme areas over here, or objectives, and then I can actually attach these 5 pieces of feedback to this one initiative the team's working on, so that I know which customer was interested in it, when they were interested in it, what did they say about it, etc. So that the product teams can look at that and say, oh, great, let me go talk to these 5 customers because they had requested it or they had asked about it at some point, and it's been in our database. So I think there's really 2 to 3 of the jobs to be done that I think about for product management tooling, for product roadmap tooling. And I think the first 2 are the most important. The third one is kind of a nice to have, that you can do manually if you don't have that. But those are the 3 key ones that I see.
So okay, now let's get specific. What's the best practice if you had to say one thing on a roadmap?
Only one thing? That's really hard. But if there's one thing, I'd wrap it up into product strategy, right? That's kind of really what it is. It's an artifact that describes your product strategy. And there's a number of different ways to do that. Like GitLab describes it in blog post form. Like they do a great job at describing it. It's very verbal, but they describe it in very verbal form. Whereas other teams might do it in a much more visual way. They did it in a very prose storytelling way. And that's maybe the secondary thing is like, you've just got to tell a story, right? You've got to tell a cohesive story as to where your roadmap is going and why, right? You do have to get to the why. So like if I said, why am I going to Phil's house? Well, it's because we're going to talk about roadmaps and we're going to do it in person. We're going to do it this way. And this is the reasons why. Like I'm going to have a good, good why behind the why, so to speak. So maybe that's the higher level question, is less about the when and more about the why.
So then let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Biggest mistake or biggest anti-pattern you see on a roadmap?
Sure. The biggest one is the one I mentioned earlier, is like people think the roadmap and the release plan are the same thing, and they try to create one artifact to do both. See it all the time, even today, the teams I talk to, they struggle with being able to do that. And then sort of the dirty secret is that I'm okay if you put a feature or two in a roadmap if it helps you with the conversation. It's like everyone knows it's a problem to solve. Everyone knows it's validated. Everyone knows that that's the thing we're going to go build. So throw that in the roadmap. It makes it easier for the rest of your company to understand it. That's okay. Otherwise, if it's not unvalidated and you don't have the clarity, then sure, put the theme or the problem to solve or the goal you're trying to achieve. But if all those boxes are ticked, there's nothing wrong with throwing a feature on there. Especially if it helps with the conversation. Because again, as a PM, it's less about, is my roadmap, technically and academically perfect? It's like, no, do you get alignment, right? It's a tool to help get alignment for where you're going. And you actually want to surface the differences in thoughts and conversations, because that will actually help you get aligned.
So how is my roadmap aligned with discovery then? Because that's kind of fundamental to getting aligned and kind of finding the differences.
If your roadmap is sort of a list of thematic elements or initiatives and problems you'd like to solve for your customer and or business, actually, ideally, it should be both, right? You should be solving for something that is user value and company value, right? It should be a mix of the two things, not just one or the other. And so, especially for things that are beyond your release plan, you should have some element of we need to be doing discovery around these things so that we know what we're tackling. Is the UX team aligned that, we're going to be tackling self-service items in the next quarter. So let's make sure any interviews we have lined up with customers, they're around how they struggle to do things or when the last time they actually had to call customer support for. And then getting data quantitatively around all the number of times. So it's, it can help identify the teams to prepare their discovery activities because they know where they should be focusing.
And so it maybe overlaps a little bit with the biggest mistake or anti-pattern. Do you have a pet hate, something you just really don't like seeing on a roadmap?
Probably, I think it's similar, but it's really the detailed dates. All right, here's, January 28th. Why? That's a project plan. We're going to, this is going to release January 28th. And it's it's July, but you're talking about January 28th is going to be the day you're going to ship it. I'm like,
So I guess so long as you're going to ship, but you can flex what's going into it, the good old iron triangle, then I guess maybe you can commit to a date, but then who knows what the heck you're going to give them.
Right. How many vacations happen during that time? Or the holidays get in the way? Does somebody get sick? Does anyone quit? Or does you hire somebody new? Does that change any of that? And the likelihood is all of those things will probably happen between now and January 28th. So don't say January 28th, unless it's we have a conference or something. An external event is causing us that we have to have this stuff ready by then. Then, okay, great. Then backplan, what is the minimum we need to have by then? And then what's the ideal? Then you start to really prioritize, I have to have this, but a lot of those things are rare. Many of them are self-imposed. And when you poke at them, you say, well, what's that date for? Well, we just like to say, or, some CEO or some executive said it should be by this date. Well, okay, but why? And if they can't answer why, there's a conference, there's other date, there's other things, something related that's usually external to the company, probably those dates, as Andrea probably says, those deadlines are BS.
We have a habit of making deadlines because we've been taught that they help us hit them, whereas actually they probably do the opposite. So, obviously, a lot of people listen to your advice on road mapping being in the book. But if you're listening to advice on road mapping, who do you listen to?
Let's see. I would listen to Bruce. I would listen to Marty Kagan. I would listen to Andrea. I would listen to Daniel Elizalde. I would listen to Gibbs Biddle, even though we have a slightly different take. He did an outcome-based roadmap with Bruce. I thought was really clever. Who else would Teresa Torres? Hope Gurion. Those are great voices, I think. And Melissa Perry. Those are people who I would listen to.
Many people I listen to. A few of them we've already got on or lined up, but a few more that I'm looking forward to talking to, hopefully in the future. Then, are there any particular resources that you use that you could recommend for people?
I think, following Teresa Torres's Product Talk is always great. Very discovery focused, but super certainly useful. Marty Kagan's Silicon Valley Product Group blog is great. Hope Gurion's Fearless Product always has some good content. The Mind the Product team, whether it be their blog posts or their podcasts, etc., has a lot of great stuff. Who else? Melissa Perry's, obviously, she's got a great podcast with her product thinking podcast. So there's a lot of stuff out there, but those are the ones that off the top of my head resonate really well.
So now this is the hardball question to see, Todd. If you had to distill your philosophy on road mapping down to one or two sentences, how would you describe it?
I'm going to puppet Janet Bastow a little bit. A roadmap is, I think I said this earlier, a roadmap is an artifact that describes your strategic intent. It is your plan, but is not committed. So it will probably change, but at least as of the most recent version, it should be your plan for where you plan to go in the future, how you want to realize your vision and goals and mission. So that's how I would describe it in just a couple of sentences. Hopefully that's good enough.
Is there anything I should have asked you about road mapping that I haven't asked?
I think the thing that we struggled with this with writing the book is in terms of thinking about how do we organize chapters. We were like, step 1, do this, step 2, this. Well, wait a minute. There are plenty of teams that might be at step 5, but actually are going to go back and do step 1. And so I think part of a lot of people don't know where to start to refine their product or they've had this feature-based roadmap the whole time, and how do they switch, right? And so a lot of it is think about where your current state is right now, how well you are aligning to a more strategic level of roadmap. Have you decoupled your release plan and your roadmap? If not, maybe that's the first thing to do. But don't try to do everything all at once. Think about doing just one small change and seeing what the impact is, right? So experiment with your internal roadmap processes just like you experiment with your product. So many times Bruce and I have done a bunch of workshops, and we've seen people super excited to go and implement everything we taught them, in the workshop the next day. I'm like, no, don't do that. You will either hate your job, quit, or get fired. That's not the point here. Pick one thing that you think can make a difference and do that, right? So it's hey, if you got a roadmap and it's a whole bunch of features, start switching the features to problems to solve or themes, right? Just do that. Then think about changing the timelines to dates, to time frames later, right? Think about just one little thing to do. And then once that's done, you see an impact, do another one, right? And that's the advice I would give to somebody on where do you start and how.
Almost feels like you need a roadmap for your roadmap.
Yes, you do. You absolutely do. And I would say that my last 2 jobs as VP of product absolutely were very critical for me to, and I actually wish I had clearly stated it at my last job, saying, look, I need to give you the roadmap for us getting to a roadmap because I'm going to make some changes. And here's what I'm going to think about doing first, second, third. I kind of wish I did that in hindsight. And with my new company, I'm actually in the process of putting that together. So yes.
I always think about a roadmap for product management team and function and product teams, not just for the product itself. And so, we may as well use the tools and techniques we use and work on ourselves and our artifacts. Great. See, Todd, it's been wonderful having you here today. I've loved this conversation. Lots to unpack from it. And I'm sure our listeners are going to lap it up and love it all. As always, to everyone out there, please do like, follow, share, and subscribe. See, Todd, I just would like to give you an opportunity to pitch yourself, the business you work for.
Sure. I love helping teams with roadmaps. I am not a consultant by trade. I am literally a practitioner. So I have a product team. My product is called Appcues right now. It's a great little thing. If you make products, you might find that super cool. But if I can help your team, let me know. But there are a lot of other consultants out there who could probably help you have more bandwidth than I do. But invite me to a guest speaker. That's probably one of the coolest things and funnest things for me to do. But thanks so much, Phil, for having me on. It's been a lot of fun. I love this topic, clearly.
It's been great having you. Yeah, so we'll make sure there's links to some of those things down below so it's people can find you, find those resources, get in touch. So just a reminder to everyone, if you are interested in being where CTOD is and taking part in the conversation, do get in touch. info@talkingroadmaps.com. Find us at talkingroadmaps.com, the website, or on YouTube, where you're probably watching this right now. CTOD, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Phil. It's been a pleasure.